Hello, everyone. This week, our topic in the Hero Myths module is on the quest and the dying god. And I like to combine these two sections because I find that there is a lot of overlap within the archetypes. So when we talk about a quest in mythology, just for a little bit of background, first of all, we often come to Joseph Campbell and his theory of the monomyth. This term, monomyth, meaning one myth, comes from Joseph Campbell's research, and in particular, a book that he published, I believe in 1949, called originally, and then of course it was republished after that, called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So what Joseph Campbell did is he examined a number of myths, and myths that are very well known to us. And he examined the story patterns that existed or it continued to exist in those myths. And he looked for commonalities. From those common elements or those common story patterns or events, he devised what he called the monomyth, the one myth, and a set of stages in that myth. Now, Joseph Campbell is very well known for coining this term of the monomyth and coming up with the idea that we repeat story patterns, culture to culture, across the world. So details in the myths may change and they may be culturally relative, but the actual story pattern stays the same. This is the idea. If we talk about ideas such as Joseph Campbell's, then we are making a return to the concept of the archetype. We've already talked about the archetype in connection to the supreme being and the great goddess. And now we come to talk about the archetype in connection to the dying god and the quest. Now we know that the concept of the archetype, as we have discussed it so far, is in connection to a set character who shows up again and again and again in our myths. But we can extend that definition now to mean a set story pattern. So an archetype then is not just a set character, but also a set story pattern that may appear again and again across myths from various cultures. The concept of the archetype, as we've looked at it so far, came forward from C.G. Jung, who's a psychologist, a Swiss psychologist. And so when we discuss myth in this way, we're really considering myth from a psychological perspective. So how does myth, or how is myth really the stuff of dreams? How does it connect to our psyche? These are the kinds of questions that we're asking. So if you remember from the beginning of the course, I mentioned that we can look at myth from various perspectives, various critical perspectives. So we can look at the myth from an anthropological perspective and perhaps examine it in connection to the culture it comes from. We can look at it from a sociological perspective and examine how the myth connects to society and oftentimes to the family. We could also look at myths historically and examine how myths connect to real historical events from the past. In this case, we're looking at the myths psychologically, from a psychological perspective. How are myths really connected to our collective unconscious minds? How are they connected to the things that appear to us in dreams? And so for that, we often look to psychologists like C.G. Jung or even Freud, and we imagine that myth comes from our deep inner psyche. Now, I believe that the groundwork was laid early for Joseph Campbell's theories. He gets the credit for the concept of the monomyth and the quest, but I really think that there were precursors to his ideas that really laid the foundation for him to bring them forward. One of those is a book that's called The Golden Bough, written around 1911 to 1915 by Sir James Fraser. And Sir James Fraser suggested the pattern of the dying god. So that is to say, we have a god or a god king or a hero who takes a journey and experiences some kind of death, whether it's a symbolic death or a real physical death, and then a kind of resurrection or rebirth. This concept or this idea of the dying god and this sort of story pattern connects very well to Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth and the quest, in that a hero is often taken on a journey of transformation, within which they experience some kind of symbolic death or a darkness, a deep darkness of the soul, for example, and then they are reborn, resurrected, transformed in some way. And so you can see how the patterns fit very, very nicely together. And that's why we look at them together in this way. Okay, so we have the groundwork in C.G. Jung's concept of the archetype and Sir James Fraser's concept of the golden bough. And Sir James Fraser did a very similar thing to Joseph Campbell. He looked at a variety of different stories and he came up with this pattern and the dying god, or the dying god archetype from there, the dying god motif from there. And then after that, we have James Campbell's concept of the monomyth, which we connect also to contemporary things like stories like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, right? And the idea of the quest. Okay. So when we look, first of all, at the concept of the dying god, as I say, we look at it in connection to the heroic quest because there are a lot of similarities there in terms of the archetypal pattern, the story patterns that exist. Heroes, gods, or god kings, they go on a journey, as I said, that involves a real or symbolic death or resurrection. The dying god is revived, if not actually brought back to the living world. So the dying god or the hero or the god king, however we should choose to label this individual, might be brought back, but perhaps not in the same way as they were before. They will be somehow transformed. And that could be an outward kind of transformation or an inward transformation, or sometimes both. Sometimes this journey is associated with the cycle of vegetation. And sometimes it's connected to a great goddess, another archetype that we've already looked at. So the dying god becomes the seed for something new. This is connected to the idea of transformation, right? So the hero, the god king goes on this kind of journey, has this symbolic death, and then in that resurrection or that rebirth becomes the seed or the start of something new. This is, as I say, if we connect this to vegetation of any kind, we can imagine any flower perhaps releasing its seeds, right? The flower itself might die, but the seed gets transported by the wind, finds new soil, and then we have the growth of something new. So the idea is very similar there. The descent into death can be seen as a metaphor for a psychological descent into the unconscious mind. So again, it can be external or it can be internal, right? The rebirth or the resurrection is not just about physical fertility, as in the case of the seed and the cycle of vegetation, But also, and this is an important quote from David Leeming on page 139, the hope of overcoming the brokenness of the ordinary life in favor of the achievement of full individuation. So this is very much a psychological interpretation of myth. That is that the brokenness of the hero or god's ordinary life is overcome by the journey and that transformation, that growth. And then the hero or the god emerges as a true individual in almost in adulthood in a way, right? They grow, they change, and they emerge, right? As a full, psychologically full individual. Sir James Frazer, in his book The Golden Bough, he suggested that the pattern of the dying god is connected or has been connected to sacrificial rites in many traditional cultures or ancient cultures of the past. Ancient cultures of the past. Too many past words there. Ancient cultures. Let's stick with that. So in cultures that used sacrifice, particularly human sacrifice of any kind, a sacred or a surrogate of some kind was sacrificed to ensure the renewed fertility of the tribe or the nation, right? So it wouldn't be the king or the pharaoh or the leader who was sacrificed, but it would be someone else in his place. This would be a symbolic sacrifice, a real sacrifice, but also symbolic sacrifice of the leader to transform the world in a way and ensure that it would continue, right? It's a kind of renewal, yes? The myths usually involve symbolic rather than actual resurrection. So this is connected to the transformation, in that the transformation is not always whole, right? So as in the case perhaps of Osiris, yes, who is resurrected but returns not to full human form, but instead to become the lord of the underworld. So he makes a return and he's resurrected, but not as his whole, complete self. Okay? In the case of Quetzalcoatl, for example, Mesoamerican myth, Toltec, Aztec, I believe, Quetzalcoatl goes through seven days of death, and then he emerges as a star. He's transformed into a star, into fire, really, right? So he's resurrected, but he transforms into something new. Okay. The dead hero god may become a flower, as in the case of Adonis, or Osiris, as I mentioned, and he becomes the king of the dead. The rebirth can also be social, and sometimes the dying god is the scapegoat. And we'll see this scapegoat motif a little bit showing up in the hero section. So the hero dies for the good of society and takes on the burdens of society's shortcomings or sins, or resolves a kind of catastrophe. So in the case of the Corn Mother, for example, whose people are starving, she sacrifices herself and then she comes back as corn. So she sacrifices herself for the sake of society, and then she makes a return as corn so that her people can be fed. Again, transformation. She comes back, but not as the same thing. The tragic hero must die before the society that they represent can turn from rottenness to normality. This is especially true if the hero restores order. So that chaos has to exist, and the hero has to go through that symbolic death, and then order is restored as the hero is restored. This is very much the roots of the tragic hero motif that we see in contemporary literature, or that we've seen over the years in literature. The concept of the tragic hero who perhaps has a flaw, goes through a period of transformation and then re-emerges as something different, has its basis in this idea, this dying god motif. Okay. So in the dying god section of the textbook, then we have several myths that are really important. The first is Mesopotamia or Sumer. We have Inanna or Ishtar, and this is viewed as one of the oldest dying god myths that we have. In it, the great goddess, she journeys to the underworld, perhaps to retrieve her lover, although this is unclear, the shepherd king Dumuzi Tammuz, from her sister or her dark other half, whose name is Ereshkigal. And it's very similar to the search of Isis for Osiris's body parts, or for Osiris himself, all of him, before he's dismembered. And Inanna's dying, so in her journey to the underworld, this is a kind of a dying, a symbolic death. It's also the death of her former self. Before she travels to the underworld, she has to let go of her 7 temples and 7 cities. And she also has to shed, over the course of her journey, the 7 me, which are viewed as sort of the pillars of Mesopotamian or Sumerian civilization. So when she arrives in the underworld, she arrives there completely naked. So she, in essence, she sheds her skins and then travels to the underworld to meet her sister, and then makes her return. In between all this, she is also hung for a period of time and has to be rescued. And then she reemerges again. When she does reemerge, she is different. She has a different view, different perspective on things. And she has to also provide a sacrifice in order to stay in the world above. And so she provides that sacrifice in the form of Dumuzi Tammuz, who has not fully supported her journey, I would say. Okay. So we have that story, Inanna, Ishtar. Egypt, of course, we have Osiris and Isis. Osiris, who is god of maize or corn. He becomes god of the underworld. I mentioned this last week, I think, when we discussed culture heroes, and that the story of Osiris is really connected to the ceremonies and rituals around mummification. That, you know, the way that his body is wrapped and whatnot by Isis, and the ways in which she copes with his death and then his resurrection, are really symbolic of the traditions and rituals around mummification in ancient Egypt. We also have Odin, who was hung from a tree for a period, and in being hung from a tree, Odin gains knowledge. So he is, as we know it from the Elder Edda or the Prose Edda that were brought forward by Snorri Sturluson, Odin, this is on page 154, he says, "I know that I hung on the windswept tree for 9 full nights, wounded with a spear, and given to Odin, myself to myself." So Odin's story and his sort of symbolic or death of being hung from a tree for a period, and then finding himself, and then gaining wisdom and knowledge, and then bringing it back to the people, fits with this archetype or this motif. And then I already mentioned the Corn Mother as well. We also have Nyambe from the Malosi tradition in Africa, but we don't have a lot of information about that. It's just a little section, a little excerpt. And so I won't speak much about that here. Okay. So as I mentioned, this dying god motif is very connected to the concept of the quest and the monomyth brought forward by Joseph Campbell. Although we don't necessarily have to refer to Joseph Campbell in order to discuss the idea of a quest, because I think that's a pretty standard story pattern across cultures. But what Joseph Campbell did for it is he really boiled it down into a series of stages, and did a lot of comparative analysis around it. A friend. The stages of concern for us in terms of Joseph Campbell's monomyth are only 3. We look at separation, initiation, and return. Just those 3. Now, of course, there are a lot of other stages, and there are sub-stages as well. But for the purposes of our study, we just look at these 3 key stages. Okay? Separation, of course, is what happens to the hero near the beginning of the journey, when the hero is separated from his or her surroundings and from what they know, essentially. The people they know, the places they know, the culture they know, the traditions they know. And then the second part is initiation, when the hero actually begins their journey. The initiation stage is the longest, because this is the place where we find various tests that may happen, or where the hero may meet helpers, for example, and really the key events of the plot will happen during that initiation stage. And then the last stage is the return, when the hero will make their way back to usually to their home or to their community. And that's when we recognize and notice the transformation that has occurred. So the hero will be returning in a different way than how they left. Additionally, the hero likely will bring back gifts, or some kind of it's often called a boon. So something that they achieve or acquire from the journey, and they will bring it back to their people and share it. Okay. So the monomyth, as it has been, it was actually a word that was coined by James Joyce, and then Joseph Campbell took it on, is described as thus. This is Leeming, page 203. A process by which the hero leaves the ordinary world of waking consciousness, enters the dark world of the supernatural, overcomes those who would destroy him there, and then returns to the ordinary realm, possessed of powers and new knowledge for his people. So, leaves the ordinary world of waking consciousness. So, it's a place of being awake, but not having knowledge or awareness, really. Enters the dark world of the supernatural. So this is sort of the dying god part, right? This is the journey into death, or symbolic death. Overcomes things that might destroy the hero. These are the tests, the monsters, those things that we are really afraid of. And then returns to the ordinary realm, usually possessing something and bringing something back to the people. Now, when we talked about guardians, messengers, and monsters, I mentioned that the monsters, and the guardians sometimes, are very often sort of the representation of our deepest, darkest fears. Yes, the artistic representation, the symbolic representation of our deepest, darkest fears. But sometimes the thing that we fear the most is death. And so this is where the dying god motif and the quest motif and the concept of the monomyth really come together. So sometimes it might be the case that the hero has to cope with a monster, conquer a monster that appears in real physical form for us. But sometimes that monster is death. And so if we can, again, if just like in the case of a monster, if we can make that concrete, then perhaps we'll be a little less afraid of it. The same is true of death. If we can describe the underworld and we can map it out and we can make it an actual location, then that a hero can, or a god of some kind can travel through and make a return from, then perhaps it's a little bit less scary for us. The journey on a quest is usually into a world of mysteries, like shamans who travel to the spirit world to retrieve lost or sick tribe members, for example. It's a mysterious adventure, yes. The hero also journeys for us. So this is back to heroes being relatable. Yes, the hero kind of carries us metaphorically into our darker side. So just as the hero is journeying, so are we. Into the unconscious realm of dreams. Again, we're back to that psychological perspective on myth. The quest, or the hero's journey, is sometimes seen as the universal metaphor for the human search for knowledge, and I would argue self-knowledge. Leeming says, we lose ourselves in order to find ourselves. Deep. So I mentioned that the 3 stages that we usually concern ourselves with are separation, initiation, and return. Additionally, what we find with the hero oftentimes is that they are miraculously conceived. So their birth is kind of amazing. So, for example, in connection to the Buddha is conceived when his mother is hit on the hip by an elephant. In the story of Water Jar Boy is conceived when his mother is impregnated by some mud, and he is born a jar and then becomes a boy. This is a very obvious transformation. Yes. So some kind of miraculous birth is often present. The hero symbolizes new beginnings and new hope for everyone. The mother who gives birth to the hero is often representative of the great goddess herself. So the birth will often take place in a hidden location, like a cave, a rock, a stable, a grove, a water pot. And this location is often symbolic of the womb of Mother Earth. So the hero is highly representative, yes? The darkest period on the journey, or I would argue into that symbolic death, is symbolic of a psychological need to become heroes ourselves. So again, we relate to the tale, to find our source. Oftentimes the source is represented as the father. So again, in Water Jar Boy, for example, he goes to look for his father. Yes, he's looking for his origin, his source. In the case of Inanna, we're not sure what Inanna is looking for, but I think that she goes to the underworld to see her sister Ereshkigal, who really is her polar opposite and representative of all of the other sides of herself. So if Inanna or Ishtar is representative of positive energy, then Ereshkigal is representative of all negatives. If we think of it not negative as being necessarily bad, but negative as the opposite of positive. So if you think of negative space and positive space, that's the kind of idea. She's Inanna's absolute complement. And I think a tale like that tells us that good does not exist without bad, and also that there needs to be balance. Yes? So is Inanna looking for her source? I don't know about that, but I would say that perhaps she's looking for balance. Yes? Sort of the other side of herself. Okay? If we look at, for example, Star Wars and Luke Skywalker, who is always wondering about who his father is, even though we all know. We could say that this is, he's a good example of looking for the source, his origin, and it's represented by his father. Sometimes there's a threat to the hero's life. maybe they're placed in a basket, they're left in the wilderness, something like that. That can also be true. And this is why heroes often have to be separated from their families in order to be successful, right? So they're placed in a basket, they're left in the wilderness. This is the start of the separation, really, and then their journey might begin from there. Alternatively, they might be called to the adventure, and if they are called to the adventure, they will usually decline or be resistant. An example here again, Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, who resists going on the journey, really has no desire, and then his door gets marked, and that's the end of it. He has to go. Okay, so this is referred to as the call to adventure, and oftentimes the hero is resistant or refuses initially to go. The quest is marked by trials, of course, confrontation, the defeat of outer monsters and inner monsters. And those monsters are culturally specific. So this is where it's important, I think, to recognize that the archetype or the story pattern may be the same, but the details are culturally specific. They are unique to each and every culture, and they're usually based on geography, landscape, tradition. Okay. So, for example, in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, we have the story of Rama and Sita in the textbook, and the Ramayana is the story of Rama. Sita is threatened by demons and demonic acts. She's threatened by the demon Ravana in the Ramayana, and in the Mahabharata, Draupadi confronts monstrous and shameful actions of her husband's enemies. Would I say that Draupadi is on a quest? I'm not sure. Last week we talked about Draupadi and the Pandava brothers, and we talked about her as a culture hero. Would I say that she's on a quest? I'm not sure. But this is where we get to a point where we consider that when we refer to stories about heroes, we often refer to them as test or quest, or sometimes both. So, and what I find is that oftentimes there's a test, but there's not always a quest. So that's interesting. Monsters are balanced by sources of strength in the hero. So heroes are often guided. They might meet wise old man, a wise old woman, a wise fool. They might have a trickster god as a companion, for example. And sometimes they'll journey to the land of the dead. In the hero section, we have two very specific ones: the Indonesian heroine Hainuwele and the African heroine Wanjiru, who both travel to the underworld. Now, both of these heroes are sacrificed by their communities. And so their circumstance is a little bit different. They don't voluntarily go on the quest. They're actually sacrificed and then reborn after their trip to the underworld. Hainuwele stays as part of the underworld, so she is transformed in that way. Wanjiru actually has the help of a warrior who brings her back from the underworld and helps her to be sort of reinserted into the community. So I don't know that Wanjiru is transformed so much as the warrior is by his connection with her. Leeming says, in the death motif, we confront the essence of what we are and who we are, I suppose. We are reborn into a new wisdom and a new wholeness. Sometimes the hero brings back gifts. And this fits with the culture heroes we talked about last week, bringing gifts to the cultures that they are part of. Could be a new crop, could be spiritual knowledge, as in the case of Odin, who brings knowledge to his people. again, it could be fire, it could be a whole bunch of things. Yes. So in this section, then, I've mentioned Water Jar Boy. I've mentioned the Buddha. We also have Wanjiru and Hainuwale, who both travel to the underworld, just as in the Dying God motif. And they also fit with the scapegoat motif, because they are sacrificed by their individual cultures. We have the story of Rama and Sita that I mentioned. Sita being captured by the demon Ravana and Rama having to save her. We haven't come to Quetzalcoatl. Oh yes, I've mentioned Quetzalcoatl, who experiences 7 days of dark and then is transformed into a star. And then, of course, there's Gilgamesh, who travels to the underworld to meet Utnapishtim and to find the answer for eternal life. Now, in the excerpt that we have, Gilgamesh doesn't find an answer. But we only have part of the larger tale. And so this is something that I think is important to remember about all the stories that we come to, all the myths that we come to in the course, is that we only look at excerpts. Yes, we only look at parts of a larger whole. And it's up to us, if we're interested in them, to examine them and to look at them a little bit further as we carry on our own quest.